Pete, thank you so much for being here. I want to welcome you. I really appreciate it. Okay, so we've been through so much change in the past 2 years with the pandemic. And I'm curious, what are the main areas of change that you've seen in organizations, either in how they've responded or maybe how they're still needing to respond with all the change?
Yeah, look, I think there's two buckets going on. One is a continuation of trends that were already underway. So the digitization or digitalization of most industries was absolutely on fire and accelerating prior to COVID, but COVID just made us see more of that, right? Challenges finding great talent and quote unquote winning the war for talent. I would say that was alive and well prior to COVID as well. But I think what COVID has done is both accelerate some of those and change the nature of some of them. So, if you look at things like the Great Resignation and the impact that's having on how we work and where we work, and people quote unquote talk about the future of work. The reality of that is it's going to be the futures of work, because every organization is going to look different, and depending on the makeup of whether you've got professionals or in plant or in factory labor, fundamentally changes the way you respond to that. And so I would say that it's an acceleration of things that are already happening, but we're now having to sort of reimagine our beliefs and our paradigms around these things. And it's not just around the future of work or the futures of work. It's also around client experience. If you think about how much people are now self-serving and how much people are increasingly using a mobile device or any kind of digital technology to interact and engage everything. I know we've got some healthcare people on the call, from the way they understand and get access to health services through to, the way they research and understand products. I know we've got some food companies or at least dairy, I think the dairy associations on the call as well. And so I think we're seeing it not just in the futures of work, we're seeing it in the omni-channel experience that people are engaging with. And and then maybe just third, to wrap up my answer to that question, for the B2B players in the room, there is a lot happening around a desire for organizations to sell the full breadth and the full spectrum of their capabilities, because we all sit back and go, oh my gosh, our business is being disrupted and we need to transform. But the fact of the matter is all your clients' businesses are being disrupted and they are trying to transform as well. And so increasingly, we're both juggling our own ability to change as well as juggling our ability to serve their needs to change as well.
So with all this change, I think it puts a lot of pressure on organizations for selecting the right speaker. And so I'm curious what you think is there a checklist? Is there factors that people should consider in bringing in the right speaker? Or more specifically, are you seeing mistakes that people are making when selecting the right speaker to get in front of their audience?
Yeah, I think as a result of the burnout that so many people have experienced in the last couple of years, you are seeing event planners indexing to, can you just make it light and fluffy and engaging and not make it too demanding or too intimidating or whatever on the team. And while I think, that was probably acceptable, 6 to 18 months ago, I think we're now moving into a period where transformation is no longer an option, where organizations don't have the ability to take a break. Like, we can't actually suspend our change, because arguably, so when I work with an audience scale and I sort of list out the major trends impacting them at a macro level, at an industry level, at a client level, and at a company level. And so you got like a 4x4 16 matrix there. And I ask them the question, are these trends speeding up or slowing down? And down to the very last audience, everyone says absolutely speeding up, because digitization begets more digitization. Government intervention begets more government intervention. Social issues amplify other social issues. And so we're seeing these things accelerate. So you could argue that we just went through the slowest period of change we're likely to experience for the rest of our professional lives, right? Now, I can imagine the people on this call right now might want to sit down and get a margarita or a shot of tequila after hearing that. But that's the honest truth, right? And the truth will set you free. And so I think as event planners and as architects of meetings, we shouldn't be afraid to continue to have expectations of our audience. Because if we don't, unless, of course, the purpose of the meeting is simply to give people a chance to reconnect. And if that's the case, you're probably running team building activities and social activities more than you're running high content speakers like me, right? But if we are there for a business objective, I would index back towards a significant ask of the audience. And I would say that the context for that, the case for that is that change is accelerating, not slowing down. But think about what events do. Events are a catalytic experience. They are moments in time. They're artificially created inflection points that we can begin to ask our team members, our association members, to go from a certain belief set to another belief set, from a certain set of behaviors to another set of behaviors. And we shouldn't waste that catalytic experience, number one. Number two, it is an opportunity to create shared language. Most organizations, even smaller organizations, are struggling with the distributed membership and a distributed workforce, right? And so increasingly, the more we can be on the same page, the easier it is to make change happen and the faster we get to move. And I believe events are a really critical contributor to creating that. And third and finally, I think the real message out there right now should be one of optimism. Yes, there's some economic headwinds. Yes, we're incredibly disrupted right now, but we have agency over our futures. Yeah, like we have the ability to create the future of work or the future of how we compete or the way we differentiate in the market. Like it's not something that we have to be reactive to. It's something that we can be proactive with. I call that moving from a burning platform where everything feels like it's on fire to moving to a burning ambition where we're really directing somewhere. And in my experience, events play a critical role in doing that, in building that optimism and building that belief.
I like the term you used, architect of the meeting. And I'd love just to hear any thoughts you have as an outside speaker who joins a meeting. How can you tell when someone has really given thought to the 2-day or the 3-day event and plan that arc and really, put the speakers in the right spot to produce the meeting, not just book a speaker?
Well, I know we didn't actually prepare these questions, but that is almost a softball tee up for me, right? Because you've seen me on calls with planners, and I ask questions like, "What's the strategic agenda for the organization? How does this meeting contribute to the journey of change and transformation? How would the CEO define success for this meeting?" And sometimes you get a completely blank stare, right? Or you ask, maybe it's an association. I know we have some sort of local business networking associations. You go, well, what are the major issues facing, the community of Indian Wells and Palm Springs? I think I saw on the list that the Desert Town Hall group was on the call, right? Well, we know what they are. We know their homelessness. There's issues with infrastructure. There's environmental challenges. It's the California government and it's this oppressive taxation and regulatory environment. But I could ask that question of some event planners and they don't really know the answer. And so I feel like that there's two levels at which you tell. One is an understanding of the value of the meeting and the objective and the outcome. And I think the second one is really being thoughtful as to where you put people on that program. Do you need someone to wrap up that sums up and pulls a red thread through the whole meeting? Are you looking to just keep people on that third and final day when your event's on the West Coast and you're worried everyone on the East Coast is going to want to fly back early? There's some, I imagine that most of the people on this call are pretty seasoned professionals. They know how that works. But it doesn't take long, Gail, to tell whether they've given it that thought or not.
Can you talk a little bit more about the red thread? Because I remember you and I were at a meeting in Colorado last December, and we had someone come in, and Sarah Michelle, I think, and she spoke a little bit about that.
It's not just a keynote that has an impact on an audience. It's a whole event that has an impact on an audience. And the more you can both architect the arc of the narrative, and by the way, let's be honest, right? Yes, events create shared language, but they're not going to remember every single thing that happened there or every piece of content. But if you think at a level of abstraction, there are some major sort of shifts you want to create in that meeting, right? And they usually, in my head, are best articulated as a from this to that, from this to that. And I'm on my way to London next Monday to facilitate a meeting I've facilitated for 8 years. It's for a very large integrated mining company that has everything from the mine all the way through to high-end retail stores. They're like a full vertically integrated business. And I've been facilitating that meeting for 9 years, and we pull every message from every year and from every speaker all the way through that meeting, because the goal of that meeting isn't just to host a meeting, it is to modernize the businesses and the client base that attend it. Because think about how many, I wonder how many of the participants on this call, I wonder how many of your organization's success is dependent on your ability to influence the way other organizations behave, and generally over whom you have no direct control. And so thinking about the event in a more holistic way, and not just as a single year event, but a multi-year event as you seek to modernize, digitize, transform, elevate the practices of that client base or of that distributor base or of those channel partners or of those members. That's the metaphor is just pulling a red thread. I don't know. I actually don't even know where the metaphor comes from. If
Look it up. I don't remember, but you're exactly right. It's just pulling that content all the way through.
I wonder where that's come from.
It's funny. Before you and I even heard the term, you might remember we had a year where I think I booked you over 40 times for AT&T. And we rolled out this content to all their various levels of management. And then you graciously met with us as we tried to identify the speaker for the following year. And we were really having trouble. And then I asked the question, well, could Pete come back with new content? And I remember you stayed up all night, did a whole plan. And yes, we did come back a second year in a row. But to me, that's probably the ultimate example of this red thread and having a message. And they got the initial concept out to all these layers the first year, and then they wanted to build on that and bring it through the next year.
Well, I mean, that is a good example of being an architect. I mean, AT&T were very, very thoughtful about the way they organized the committee. So they had a great event team, but they had a committee of business leaders driving the content, you know, and we'd had so much success in impacting the business the year before, the thought that we could repeat that and do that again and create continuity. Now, don't forget at the time, AT&T made the acquisition of DirecTV. You know, the chairman was seeking to roll that business up before then later splitting off the media business, which included the acquisition of Warner, blah, 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 blah. The point being, there was a strategy at play in the company, and the committee driving the content weren't thinking about their 1 year. They were thinking about the driving of that strategy. And so, you know, I think that was less, as much credit as we should take for that. I think that the client gets as much credit for thinking that holistically about that.
Yeah, I love that.
By the way, I just, I Googled the origin of red thread, and it comes from ancient Greek mythology. And so I've just pasted it into the chat. So it was nothing, I thought it was like some modern haberdashery metaphor, but no, it goes all the way back to Theseus and Minotaur.
That's awesome. Okay, my next question, shifting just a little bit, but what is the role of a leader during this time of change?
So I would say one, it is to instill a sense of confidence in the membership, in the audience, in the local business community, because the more uncertainty an individual faces, the greater anxiety they will manifest. And by the way, anxiety is the fastest spreading emotional affect inside an organization's culture, right? And so if people are fearful and there's an absence of information, they will fill that vacuum with the scariest and most depressing propositions, okay? And so a leader has to, one, have a highly visible point of view, a very clear point of view, and a point of view that's built on agency, a belief in our ability to influence our futures, and I would argue confidence and optimism. And sometimes we use the word intentional optimism, because it's not like it's easy out there, or that there's not competitive threats, or that the social issues aren't challenging. Or I have a client right now that produces 40% of their hardware in Russia. I mean, can you imagine what that's doing to their supply chain? They have a multi-billion-dollar backlog right now, and they might miss their numbers for the first time in 20 years as a result of this geopolitical thing. So it's not like it's easy out there, but you still have a role as a leader to visibly, clearly, optimistically, intentionally optimistically paint a picture of the future, or at least paint a picture of our ability to be successful in that future, even if we don't know exactly how it plays out. So I would say that would be role number one. I think number two is that leaders, the mistake leaders make is they confuse agreement with alignment, okay? So they say things like, does the strategy make sense? Or, you know, do you agree, or can you imagine this being a great path forward? And everyone nods, sits around the boardroom table or sits in the audience and nods their head. That's a very different reality than actually changing your behavior, spending your time in new ways, getting tight on your focus. And so a leader has to not just clarify direction, they have to create a setting that encourages and removes the friction required for humans to change. Because here's the thing, companies don't transform, people do. And people get headaches, and people are scared, and people have ego. I mean, take that AT&T example. At that time, the shift was from a hardware-defined world to a software-defined world. So AT&T had like 100,000 staff that split copper wires and built networking infrastructure that had to move into a world of software coding. And the biggest barrier was not that they didn't have the capability to be good at that. But imagine you'd spent 30 years splitting copper wire, and now you're asking them to go back to school and be an amateur again and learn how to code, right? Now, Randall Stevenson was guaranteeing them a job if they were prepared to do the education and was paying for their education. But they were having trouble getting people to sign up and opt in because no one wanted to go back to work the next day as a beginner again. Their ego was attached to being the go-to person, right? And so you can't just set direction, you have to create a setting. Now, third and final, because by the way, the answer to your question has been 22 years of my life, all right? So like, I can't answer it in 2 minutes or less. But the third thing I would say about that is that we need to give more attention to the human part of that journey. Doesn't matter how clear your strategy is, because in this environment with the Great Reset, the Great Resignation, and I would say a radical reimagining of the social contract between organizations and individuals. I'm happy to double click onto that if you want me to, but this redrawing of the social contract means that you can't just tell people what to do and think they're going to get it done. Like, you need to actually lead them there. And that requires much greater level of intentionality and much greater focus and effort. Now, I know this is a long answer, but think about this. Is it easier to set strategy or to change human behavior? It's a lot easier to set strategy, like significantly easier. And yet, if you did a time and effort study of supervisors, managers, directors, VPs, EVPs, and above, you would find they spend 90% of their time in the what has to happen and less than 10% working with the whose behavior needs to shift. And I think in great organization, that ratio, in great transformations, and I've sat with 45 CEOs on that journey in the last 15 years, the ratio is flipped when it's done well.
I know in your formal introduction, there's a line where you say, organizations can't go commercially where the leaders won't go personally.
Yeah.
And I know you've had to personally work with me on that. There was a time when I would sit down with Pete and I'd be like, what's wrong with all these people? And in the most clever way he could get me to see, the common thread was moi. And I think that's what you are so credible at, Pete, is really going into that C-suite level and identifying what the objective is, but then helping them all realize the role they play in that.
Yeah, look, I mean, I personally have no interest in showing up at anyone's conference, doing a tap dance and leaving. It's a better investment of your money and much better investment of your people's time and mine if we focus on an objective and move people towards it, right? But your comment around organizations only go commercially where people first go personally is sounds like a throwaway line, but it's actually a deeply powerful concept. Because I'll tell you what, I have never met an attendee in any audience at any level that didn't know exactly what was impacting their businesses and exactly what they should do about it. Maybe not exactly what they should do about it, but roughly what they should do about it. Everyone knows the trends. Everyone knows the changes. Showing up and going, oh my gosh, there's a war for talent out there. People are going to be like, really, bro? Like, you paid me, you paid you to come and say that, right? And so what happens is that we tend to get stuck in awareness of what's happening. And we confuse the fact that we show up at a conference and talk about it with actually doing something about it, right? And so everywhere I go, Gail, people are like, we need to be more agile. We need to be more agile. We need to be more agile. And they think that's about systems. They think that's about structure. They think that's about reporting lines and matrices. And no, matrices actually. What it's ultimately about is psychology, okay? Because in my experience, it is the closing the gap between awareness of change and the need to change, closing the gap between awareness and true acceptance of that. Because once you accept that it's time to change, the answers are pretty easy. They're not that complicated. Getting people to change is hard, but knowing what has to change is not, right? And so the point is that it's usually a personal resistance, like, well, I'm retiring in 3 years, or my bonus is tied to quarterly numbers, or, you know, we're reporting to the investment community every 90 days, and they insert insert an external reason for personally being afraid to take professional risk. That's why it's kind of like, I mean, literally, we've been involved in the most spectacular corporate transformations in history. Fortune 5 companies, the whole deal. And I'm telling you, it is therapy that gets it done. It's not strategy. It's not PowerPoint decks. It's not market analytics. It is working with leaders to accept the fact that they're driving it and that they have to take risks. Or as I like to say, the role of a leadership team is to migrate its organization from one competitive advantage to the next with the least amount of damage possible. That's their job, right? And the more the external environment's changing, the more we have to migrate, or to put that slightly differently, if the rate of external change is faster than the rate of internal change, then you're becoming less relevant, right? And so you have to be prepared to take professional risk to advance an organization's agenda.
That's good. Is there anything that you're working on now that's new that we want to make sure people are aware of?
Yeah, I actually am working on a concept. Well, I'm working on the research for a concept right now that's called front running. Now, some of you might have heard the term front running before, but which is technically an illegal trading strategy where you build faster pipes to the exchange. And when someone makes a trade on a financial, like an equities product, you trade slightly ahead of them and you arbitrage the gap. But it's, even though that's a terrible practice, it's a really powerful metaphor. And the metaphor is, how do you stay 30 seconds ahead? 30 seconds ahead of the competition, 30 seconds ahead of the customer's expectations, 30 seconds ahead of your organization's need for you to grow your own capability. So, a simple example of that is, I have a fundamental belief that the companies that outgrow the mean or the median for their industry and their competitive set always do it by leading the customer to the future rather than following them or their competitors there. That strategies of fast followership don't really work today like they might have 20 years ago because of the rate of change. Not to mention that what happens is, if you're reacting to your customers' needs rather than helping them lead those needs into the future, then you end up in an RFP-like process every time, where you're getting traded off against competitive alternatives, where ultimately price becomes the fundamental differentiator. But there is a place to go that's value added, that's beyond that. I think we have the dairy, the IDFA on the call, right? Or at least they had accepted the call. You look at where all the growth is in the dairy industry. It's coming from value add. It's coming from adding probiotics to liquid milk. It's coming from cheese and yogurt. It's coming from snacking-based access to dairy products. Like, these are things where the customer is giving you an early market signal about where they're going. And if you're a smart business leader, you are just getting ahead and seeing where that trend is headed. But it's not just for market competition. I think it's a philosophy for personal growth as well. And it's this idea that your organization is going to need you to have different skills in 12 months than you have right now. Are you investing in your own growth? Because, I said, if the rate of change outside the organization is faster, well, what if I rephrase that, Gail, and I said, if the rate of change outside of your personal rate of professional growth and learning is faster than your rate of professional growth and learning, then you're becoming less relevant too. And so we have an obligation to grow ourselves. We have an obligation to do it ahead of the external rates of change. So that's what we're working on right now. I mean, I'm already doing a lot of speaking in and around that topic with clients now, but at some point here in the next 12 months, I'll probably publish on that topic as well.
That's it. That's cool. Very interesting. I think I told you who was going to be on the call, like literally 1 hour, and then you've mentioned 3 or 4 different people, which leads me to this question. How do you research your content when you're getting a new client?
Oh, well, that's a pretty serious process. So I have a team of people that help me with that, but it starts with making sure the event's a good fit. Okay. Like, I have no interest in showing up somewhere where there's someone could have done a better job. If I feel like I'm best fit, best in class, yes. Then usually I have a minimum of a 1 hour conversation. And as you know, Gal, there's no logistics in that conversation.
Right.
That is questions of strategy. It's questions of disruptions. It's questions of transformation. It's questions of what are the cultural barriers? What's really getting in the way? What are the elephants in the room? How do you position this? Do you want me to be aggressive? Do you want, like, we really dissect the role, the keynote, or the workshop. And as you know, I love extended sessions where you can like actually get interactive. And I don't care if there's 2,000 people, I'm going to make that happen, right? And so it's a real set of deep inquiry. Followed by that, you know, we'll get the annual reports, we'll sign an NDA, usually get the strategy decks, we'll get the engagement survey, see where the team's at. And straight, I don't know whether you think this is surprising or not, but as you know, clients are willing to share that if you're prepared to do something with it.
That's right.
And so that begins about a 24-hour process. I don't mean 24 consecutive hours, but about 20 to 25 hours worth of work around distilling that into a clear picture of the changing reality. 2, a clear picture of the from to, like, well, where's the opportunity, right? And then a clear picture of what alignment looks like. Because basically what I've come to learn is that transformation is the companies don't transform, people do. That's a psychological journey first, strategic second. It starts by moving from awareness of change to acceptance. It is only sustained when you get out of crisis mode and go from a burning platform to a burning ambition. Stop scaring the crap out of everybody. You're going to get no sustained effort. They're already burned out anyway. And then finding a way to move humans from agreement to alignment. And so the research sort of begins to position the client's reality and content inside of that worldview. And then, you know, I mean, I must have 150 personal case studies of clients that we've worked with. I mean, I've done 45 actual transformations with real companies, mostly publicly listed. And so I'm now picking the stories from real world experiences, not some academic exercise. And so, you know, the last 10 hours I will do, and that'll be around crafting the message in alignment with the narrative, and then picking the case studies that tie that together.
It makes me think 2 things. One, it helps people understand speaker fees, because often someone will say, oh, that's how much they get paid for an hour. And you just built the case that it is far more than an hour to get up there and deliver real content. The other thought that went through my head is that is an example, folks, of a thought leader who does the homework and prepares a customized presentation versus, you know, I love me a good inspirational speaker, but often they can really tell the same story to almost every audience. And so I think when you're looking for content for a very sophisticated audience, you want someone that's willing to do that kind of research. There's such a different variety of speakers. You know it, I know it. And, you know, I book the same speakers over and over. We recently published our top 23 speakers over the last 23 years. And you know, you were right at the tippy top. And it's because of the care that you put into it. And I know when I recommend you, I know how happy everyone's going to be. And I know how hard you work for that. I mean, we're friends, but I know how hard you work. And I really, really appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Okay. Well, I think, how are we doing on time? We are right on the money, 2 minutes over. I thank you so much. I know how busy you are, and I really, really appreciate it. I wanted people to have a chance to hear you and hear about your process and hear what's on your mind. And if any of this resonated with others and you're interested in bringing Pete in to speak to your organization, please give us a call. We would love to make that happen.